This content is AI generated for informational purposes only and should not be directly used for clinical decision-making.
Hello and welcome back to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. I'm Dr. Aris, Senior Attending Neurosurgeon.
And I'm Dr. Alara, Research Fellow. Today we're looking at a fascinating new study from the Neurosurgical Review, published in 2026, titled Anatomical and Quantitative Analysis of Safe Entry Zones to the Lower Brainstem Through the Far-Lateral Approach.
This is a crucial topic, Ilara. We often describe the brainstem as a thumb-sized structure, yet it compresses an incredibly dense collection of nuclei and long tracts. When we talk about the medulla oblongata specifically, we are dealing with the reticular networks for cardiorespiratory control and the exit points for cranial nerves 6 through 12. Even minimal manipulation can lead to devastating neurological complications.
Exactly. And that's why this paper focuses on safe entry zones, or SEZs. These are consistent anatomical corridors that allow us to access intrinsic lesions, like cavernous malformations or focal gliomas, while minimizing damage to those eloquent nuclei, tracts, and perforators.
Right. Historically, we've relied on qualitative descriptions. We know the pre-olivary sulcus or the posterior median sulcus are there. But what this study by Cavalcanti and colleagues adds is a quantitative geometric framework. They wanted to measure exactly what kind of elbow room a surgeon has when using the far-lateral approach to reach these zones.
To do this, they used 10 formalin-fixed human cadaveric heads. They simulated operative positioning and performed far-lateral approaches under neuronavigation. They weren't just looking at the anatomy, they were using customized software to calculate the exposure area, the horizontal and vertical working angles, and the vertical linear extent of the exposure.
That's the measurable operative geometry the authors mention. Let's dive into the approach itself. The study notes that while a midline suboccipital approach is great for posterior sulci, the far-lateral route is optimized for the ventrolateral medulla and the olivary region. Ilara, what did the actual dissection involve?
The far-lateral approach in this study typically involved the partial removal of the C1 arch and limited drilling of the occipital condyle. They focused on identifying reproducible surface landmarks. It's important to note for our listeners that they specifically looked at the medullary and pontomedullary levels. They didn't include anterior medullary SEZs because the far-lateral corridor doesn't actually provide the right geometry for those.
That's a key distinction. If you're going for the anterior medulla, you're looking at a different trajectory. Now, let's get into the numbers because that's the heart of this paper. What was the average exposure area they found?
The average exposed area for the far-lateral approach was 856.8, plus or minus 139.7 square millimeters.
That's quite a significant area of the brainstem surface being visualized. But as we know in the OR, seeing it is one thing, being able to work there is another. This is where the working angles come in.
Precisely. For the olivary zone, which is the primary target for this approach, the horizontal working angle was 40.8 degrees. The vertical working angle was even more generous at 54.8 degrees.
Those angles are vital. For the residents listening, remember that the working angle defines your maneuverability. If you have a narrow angle, you're essentially working down a straw. A 40 to 50 degree window allows for much safer instrument manipulation and better visualization around the lower cranial nerve rootlets.
And they also measured the vertical linear extent of the exposure, which came out to 60 millimeters. This gives us a concrete idea of how much of the brainstem's length is accessible from this single far-lateral corridor without having to reposition or extend the craniectomy unnecessarily.
Let's talk about the clinical application of these SEZs. The paper mentions that these are conditional corridors. Can you expand on that?
Right. The authors emphasize that while these zones are anatomically safe in a general sense, the selection of an entry point must be individualized. You have to look at the lesion's pathomorphology, how it grows, whether it presents to a peel or ependymal surface, and how it displaces the surrounding tracts. You use these anatomical landmarks as a map, but you refine the entry point using image guidance and, most importantly, neurophysiological monitoring.
It's a multimodal approach. The anatomy gives you the door, the neuronavigation gives you the key, and the monitoring tells you if anyone is home. The study specifically highlights the olivary region. Why is that zone so prominent in this far-lateral analysis?
The olivary zone is a classic landmark. The far-lateral approach provides a direct trajectory to the ventrolateral medulla. By quantifying this, the study supports the far-lateral route as an effective and reproducible corridor. When we see a lesion in the olivary region, we now have data telling us exactly what kind of working window to expect.
I think this is particularly useful for preoperative planning. If a resident comes to me with a cavernous malformation case in the medulla, we can now look at these coordinates and angles to decide if the far-lateral approach will truly give us the vertical extent we need to reach the poles of the lesion.
Exactly. The paper suggests that converting microsurgical medullary anatomy into these measurable parameters can actually improve surgical safety. It moves us away from just guessing the trajectory based on 2D images and gives us a 3D geometric expectation.
It's interesting that they used 10 specimens and found such consistent results. It speaks to the reliability of the far-lateral approach for this specific anatomy. Did the study mention any limitations regarding the parenchymal anatomy?
Yes, they were very clear that they performed no intrinsic parenchymal dissections. The objective was to preserve the anatomical integrity of the surface landmarks. So while they define the entry zones on the surface, the study doesn't dive into the internal displacement of nuclei by the lesions themselves. That's where the clinical individualization comes in.
That makes sense. Every tumor or malformation is going to shift the safe internal geography, but you can't get inside safely if you don't have a clear, quantified path through the surface.
And just to recap for our audience, we are looking at an 856.8 square millimeter exposure area, roughly 40 degrees of horizontal maneuverability, and nearly 55 degrees of vertical maneuverability.
This paper really provides a quantitative anatomical framework that was previously lacking. It's one thing to say the far-lateral approach is great for the ventrolateral medulla. It's another thing to define the operative field with this level of precision.
It definitely bridges the gap between the lab and the OR. For anyone looking to review the specific landmarks they used for their neuronavigation coordinates, the full paper lists 7 standardized landmarks on the brainstem surface that were used to calculate these areas.
This is essential reading for anyone tackling intrinsic medullary pathology. It reinforces that with careful planning, the thumb-sized medulla isn't quite as inaccessible as we once feared.
Well, that's our deep dive into the far-lateral approach and the safe entry zones of the lower brainstem.
Thank you, Dr. Ilara, and thank you all for listening to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. Stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Goodbye, everyone.